Hi, this is Pete Lyons of Let's Play Salesforce, and in tonight's Tableau CRM video, we are going to finally answer the question that we've all been waiting to get an answer to. Ed, where's my histogram? With that aside, we do have some good stuff to talk about, and yes, Ed is here to answer that and many more questions, but really what we're going to be talking about tonight is time zones. Before we get into that though, Ed has an extremely long history with the product, so I'd like to give him an opportunity to introduce himself so that we can have a little more context around that. Ed, over to you.
Well, thanks for the intro, Pete. Yes, I have been with this product now for, I think it's about 9.5 years. I joined as part of a company called EdgeSpring, which was then acquired, and that was a lot of the foundational technology behind Wave, which became Einstein Analytics, which became Tableau CRM. So a lot of history. When I started, I was really just, I was doing a lot of field implementations and helping customers kind of get started. And been a PM ever since, kind of working on building out the product. I now focus on what we call authoring. So basically anything where you use to kind of build content, explore dashboards, and how do you build out that content and kind of that runtime that houses the content. But yeah. So there's my long extensive history, and it's been a wild ride. And Timezone has been, I mean, almost half of that time we've been kind of working on something related to Timezone. It was a big project. So there's a lot of nuance here to unpack.
And I understand that in addition to the work that you do with analytics, you're also an experienced martial artist and a fancy dancer.
Probably more experience on the martial arts than the fancy dancing, but yes.
All right, so enough of this. Let's see some cool stuff about Timezone. Do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
All right. So maybe start with a setting, because we've actually got a great visualization in, for the most part, we really wanted this to look the same. You shouldn't really notice too much difference about using Timezone. But maybe let's walk through the settings. So there's kind of a lot of things here of, remember that this feature is single custom time zone. So we wanted everybody to be able to not have to default to GMT, because a lot of people don't run their businesses on Greenwich Mean Time. So when you go, you have to pick that org time zone. And then we also have this dashboard time zone. Now, most of the time, these are actually going to be the same thing. In fact, we almost expect all the time you're going to have these the same thing. The reason why we broke these out, and actually it probably helps to go into a little bit of background here, is why is this such a big deal? And the reason this is a big deal is because the way that Tableau CRM works is we pre-index so much information. So whenever you have a dimension value like month, we look up all of the rows that are associated with that. Something like time zone tweaks what rows are associated with that month. So in order to pre-compute that index, we have to do a whole bunch of work up front during the data flows and the recipes to pre-compute all these indexes. So if we do something like, hey, let's change your time zone, we've got a whole bunch of work to just recompute everything. So that's why this is a single custom time zone, because we decided, hey, we're only going to recompute. And if you remember, there's like 10 or more date components, right? We've got year, quarter, week, month, day, hours, minutes, seconds. Then we've got the fiscal component. So there's a lot that we could have to recompute per time zone. If we did like all 44 time zones, it would just be just way too much work. So with this phase, we're working on one single custom time zone. You pick what it is. Now, if I were to change this, if you try to query a time zone that doesn't exist, it's going to give back an error message. But for backwards compatibility, we always allow the GMT index to be created. So let's say if I'm in Pacific time, the backend will always compute the Pacific time zone, and then it will also compute GMT. And that way, with the GMT, all of the legacy content you have will still work. It will still be shown in GMT. Now, if for some reason you ever had to change your time zone, let's say you move your org headquarters from Los Angeles to New York City, then what you want to do is, if you were to just switch the time zone, everything would fail, because all of the time zone indexes are computed on a different time zone than what you have. So we didn't want you to be in that situation where if you change something, all your dashboards instantly fail. What you would do is you would set your dashboard viewing time zone to GMT. Everything works, but it's in GMT. You kick off all your data flows, run all of your data flows again, and then everything will be computed, and you switch to the new time zone. So at least you have that path. Now, we don't expect you to be moving your headquarters geographically that often, but we just wanted to give you that option in case you needed 100% uptime while you do some sort of a migration like that.
Or if you hit the button wrong when you set it up in the first place.
Yeah, you could just choose the wrong time zone. So that's kind of one thing to cover. Maybe let's go into a little bit more about how it works. I mean, in the end, like I said, it works very similar. We've got, date components, but it's really when you kind of look under the covers, and maybe I'll show you a little bit of that detail of, when we do this, what you'll notice is when you group by, we're actually, instead of, remember it was close date underscore quarter, now this is the quarter of close date, the year of close date. So you'll notice that the way we do kind of the groupings, the way we project them in these for each generates are a little different. We can even go back and maybe let's Command E, and even the way that it is represented in the JSON, the quarter and close date, instead of, again, close date underscore quarter. So everything's just a little different anywhere that you had a date. And this has downstream effects, like if you have a saved view and that saved view is saving a date filter, if you're using a date range filter, a lot of these things, all that nuance. And it gave us a chance to kind of go back and clean up a lot of the date things. One of the things you may notice, if you look at a dashboard now, you go in, you could see epochs. And what we do is we actually store, for a date range, we store the epoch of midnight GMT for a particular date. So we wanted to clean some of that up so we're not actually assuming GMT. And so that's kind of some of the things. But we now kind of tied these two things together, these new dates, like having a date as a true SACL type and the time zone feature. So that means that when you use this feature, you have to migrate your stuff to these new dates. And that's one of the reasons we did it. We said, look, you're just going to have to make new dashboards because we can't guarantee, at least at this early stage, that we're going to be able to migrate your content and not have any errors in that migration. What we're saying is, hey, if you want to use this feature, you need to make a new dashboard. And when you do, it'll automatically add the things. The cool thing is we've added a little bit of syntactic sugar. Like before, we've always had this where you have to choose individual components or combined components. Now we've added a feature of merge dates. So if you mess up and you're like, no, I didn't want individual components, I can merge them together. And I think there's a little bug there. All right, so right here, I am going to go into close date and I'm going to add, let's say I add a compound date there. So now I have year quarter. I can go in here and I can also split the dates. So now there's just with one hit, I can actually break this out into much more complex components. Let me go back and let's try something a little bit even more fun. Let's say, well, this is a date field. Let's actually see if we have a date time that we can use. So here's a date time. So now I can do year, month, day, hours, minutes, seconds. And then I can go in here and we can split. And now I have all the individual components and you can drag and drop and move them around or delete them. So we just kind of added that because we knew that people were going to be using these components a lot more. So we wanted to have ways that you can kind of not have to know up front exactly what you're going for, and kind of play around with that. So now you've got like a true date type, there's a lot of different things that you can do with these. So we tried to kind of improve some of the usability, especially there's some nuance with like window functions when you're doing like period over period comparisons. Where does it work with a compound date? Do you need two independent? So we try and clean a lot of that up. What we're actually doing, if you look at a lot of this SACL, and let me go back, is really what we do is we project them all individually. So every time we do this, we just project them as multiple columns. And it's not until we get to the UI layer that we wrap them. And the way we wrap them, if you're familiar with the column map, we do one of these syntaxes in the column map or in the dimension axis. And this is basically what tells the chart, hey, take these 6 individual fields, and I actually want you to put them together, concatenate them together into one formatted date. So we do that all at the UI layer, because as we're doing like faceting and filtering and all that, we actually just treat them as individual columns.
All right, so a couple of questions. First, when you talk about how would we even have like an auto conversion process and why it's not here today, I think to myself, well, if I look at a date filter in compact form, just, I create a lens, I filter by, my date greater than or equal to a value. I see epochs or epochs. I know it's not pronounced epic, but I say epic. Or if I filter by a relative date range, I see like, that date field, the granularity, the plus and the minus. It's very easy to follow. There's a consistent structure. And so something like that, I imagine you could build a conversion tool for. Some sort of thing that iterates over that loops over the JSON of the dashboard and fixes all that stuff. But what you're never going to solve for is the level of creativity that you have enabled through this platform. So for example, when I'm projecting dates in SACWL, a lot of times I want to give a user the ability to change with a toggle selector. Do I want to view this quarter over quarter, year over year? And so what I'll do is, created date will just be created date, but that underscore quarter or underscore year or whatever, that'll be controlled through a binding on a static step. And there's no way, no matter how fancy of a JSON parsing tool you could ever build, it will break something. You can't solve for that level of flexibility. So, I imagine that it's still reasonable to make some attempts, but there's no way that you can stop it from breaking everything.
And that's exactly it. I mean, you hit the nail on the head in that, like, there's the basic case, right? The simple steps are easy. But there is this long tail of you see some of the SOCL that customers are writing is just crazy, just massive, lots of complexity. And, there's some cases where it doesn't matter how how much code we throw at it. Like, we're not going to be able to solve that 100%. Now, I think maybe, at some point we will release an 80% solution, maybe a utility to kind of make your life easier. But we're never going to have a 100% solution. There's always going to be some manual intervention of, just like complex queries where you have to kind of go in, or some people are binding, like they're binding dates. So then we'd have to go into the static step and look at the syntax there. And I don't think we're going to be able to train a computer to be able to do that smartly and intelligently without breaking anything.
Yeah. And I feel like the last time that we observed a similar shift was when we went from the classic dashboard designer to the flex designer. And I remember getting really frustrated with the utility because it would try to rearrange your widgets, but what happened would be kind of like what happens when you break at a game of pool. But the important part was still there. You still had all those same fundamental pieces. That was a valid point of beginning the restoration process. It was far better than having nothing wrong.
Absolutely. And actually, here on the screen this is one of the nuances. It's an improvement, but it's a difference. And you notice that these dates are now numbers. When you group, you're actually getting a number returned and not a string. So the cool thing about that is now these actually sort numerically. As you know, our strings are sorted lexicographically, so that's why you always see those 0 prepending. Because if the zeros aren't there, then the sort order is going to look really weird. So now we can drop those zeros because these are true numbers. But there's a lot of different nuance of how I use this in SACL, how I use this in JSON, because it's a number. I can't just concatenate them together. There's other things that have to happen in the process to make sure they're formatted correctly if I'm doing some formatting magic.
So I would assume, though, that while we are grouping by a number, the system probably in some way treats it almost like a string. Otherwise, I guess where I'm going with this is, does this allow, in theory, for the possibility to group by a number for maybe a visualization like Histogram.
Well, yes. I don't even know if I should say this, but I think there are some cases where actually grouping by a number does work. We don't officially support it though, because it's not a common use case that we've really tested and hardened. But you can play with that and see how far you get. It actually works better than I thought. So yeah, there are ways to group. Histogram's an interesting one because of, really the true problem in histogram isn't a visualization problem, it's a bucketing problem.
Yeah.
And, then we get into great debates of like, well, what's the best way? Well, the best way is to bucket in ETL, right? Because then we compute indexes. So is this an ETL problem or is this a UI problem? But if we do it on the UI, well, it's not going to be as fast as everything else. So, how can we make it faster? Well, we got to, push some stuff to ETL. All right. So it gets to be kind of some fun cyclical discussions that, I think we're still looking for the ideal solution and when are we going to have time to do it?
Yeah. And I would argue that there's two sides to that coin, because while bucketing in the ETL layer is ultimately going to give you better performance because you've got that indexing, any kind of ETL layered logic is not ever going to be able to respond to things like global filters and passing. So you can get a more performant bucket, but a less dynamic one, and you have to kind of strike that balance. So some more practical questions for us. Obviously, it's important for users to know that there's a good amount of work ahead of you if you want to move to time zone. So you don't necessarily want to just like jump off the bridge, hit the button, and just see what happens. You need to kind of like scope that out. Maybe do it in a sandbox first, or at least somewhere where you can try it. But before you set yourself up for a ton of work just because somebody wants this button to get pressed, like you really need to dive into the use case. It's the same thing with like doing real time. Are you going to write Apex steps and SOQL steps when really it's just about messaging to the business? Well, hey, the opportunity life cycle on average is like 6 months. So why is an hourly data flow not good enough for you? It's more about messaging. So when we as consultants are working with our clients to help them understand, is time zone right for you? What are the kind of questions we should be asking the business to nail that down?
I mean, I'll start with kind of the main thing, because you I'm sure are more familiar than anybody of the workarounds, right? Of just kind of shifting time, right? Shifting by hours. I've even seen people do case statements to correct for daylight savings times for the past like 20 years. So you can absolutely do that in ETL.
My DST and leap year breaks down. It works in the year 2000, but it won't work in 2100 or 1900.
So it's Y2K compliant, huh?
Yes, I have a Y2K compliant leap year and DST offset.
Because the big complaint that we got is more around relative to what. And because when you send queries to the SQL engine, you may say things like today, this quarter, last quarter, and it's always going to use today GMT as that relative point to offset from. And so where you'd see it the most is in Asia Pac, where the quarter would change in GMT before it would change for you locally. And so you would do things like, hey, I'm going to have it set a dashboard and I want to see this quarter. And there would be people like, hey, I'm trying to close out my quarter. So I'm going to keep hitting refresh on this the evening of. And at some point in the evening, right, it will actually in GMT will switch over to next quarter. And suddenly you're going to see next quarter, which doesn't have any business closed yet because it's next quarter. And when next quarter becomes this quarter, right, your dashboard just starts zeroing out and everybody just freaks out because you're like, oh my God, did we just lose all of our money? Did we lose all of our deals? Is our analytics? It's like, no, it's next quarter.
And all the sales reps scrambling to get their data in on the last day of the quarter before it kicks over. And well, where did it end up? This yeah. But definitely it's the further you are from GMT, the more it becomes a problem.
Yes. And in which direction kind of even matters a little bit too. Sometimes you don't care if after midnight, whatever. So yeah, so think about like that problem and how much that really impacts you. And then keep in mind that right now we're solving the single time zone of, hey, my headquarter, or the way we calculate financials, whatever, most of our users are in this one time zone. So this really only solves it for that one time zone. Safe harbor, of course, we do want to expand this to multiple time zones, and actually doing this new dates that you see, this new construct, is a scalable format. So we hope we can support more time zones. But we should also be transparent of the way Salesforce does time zone, because they don't pre-index in Salesforce core. It's easy for them to say, hey, we're going to support 44 time zones, and it'll just be dynamic. When you log in, if you just take a plane and go to another time zone, you can just view it in that time zone. We're never going to be that way. We always want to pre-index. We need an admin, somebody to go in and say, which indexes do you want me to create? And so I think even for our next stage of this, we'll probably just say, hey, give us a set instead of one. And as long as your users are in one of these set, they will. But that's all kind of future stuff for us to work on.
Well, and interesting question is, when we establish the time zone in which the quarter changes, whose midnight is it? Is it the midnight of the currently logged in user, or is it the midnight of where the business took place? So, for example, if I run a store in the U.S. and I want to know when we went from the day shift to the night shift, it's based on the location of the store. So even if I travel to Europe and I want to see how much business did we do during the night shift, it doesn't matter where I am. It matters where the data was. So, a lot of people just say, well, give me this feature. And it's like, okay, well, in order to give you this feature, we have to give you all of this stuff, and you are going to have to take on all of the burden that comes with it.
Absolutely. Because right now we kind of punted that problem because it's one time zone. It's usually your HQ, and so everything's in that. And the good thing about that is now you and I, if we're sitting on different time zones, we can look at the same dashboard and be seeing the same data. Once we do open it up to multiple time zones, then that's a really tough question of, all right, well, if we're looking at the dashboard and you're in EST and I'm in PST, we may actually see different data for how much money we made this quarter. And we could be arguing about things and be like, well, wait a minute. Oh, you see a different number than me. So it can create confusion. It also brings up kind of one of the design principles that I kind of push out. For now, we're saying we're not putting the time zone anywhere. If you want to advertise the time zone, like put a text widget up top and say, this is all calculated as of EST or PST. But we wanted to kind of take it out because we assume that once you kind of turn this on, you're just going to make everything in this time zone, and everybody's just going to assume everything is in my HQ time zone. And you really don't need us putting to the Chrome and the header and all the way advertising that time zone. It just is what it is. But once we get to a multi-time zone, then there's the question of, well, do I let the user now dance around the multiple time zones? So it's like, hey, I know I'm joining a call with my boss on PST. I'm actually going to set my time zone to PST just so I can see the same numbers of him and we can talk, apples and apples.
So a couple other questions that I had. One, is it safe to assume that all of these nice cleanup items that around how we interact with date fields do not apply to users that don't turn on this feature? Like, I can't go and use these functions in a non-time zone enabled way.
Yes. We're applying these on just these new dates. There is another thing going on in parallel, and we have another initiative we're calling Compact Form 2.0. And that is, if you go into the data blending UI, what you'll notice is the JSON syntax of a blended step, which can be multiple data sets coming together, is a little bit different than the traditional basic step. And what we're actually trying to do is standardize on that because it's more flexible. I can bring in multiple data sets. So we're trying to do a push to kind of standardize on that so that we don't have to support this kind of snowflake of different syntaxes. And every time we add a feature, and what you'll notice is that that actually kind of works very well with the new dates, and the kind of the way we project and use things is very similar. So I think there's a lot of, dare I say it, synergy there for those things. So what you're going to see, I think, in the next couple releases, you'll see some kind of push towards that. One way to make that jive with Timezone. I mean, we do kind of hope that this Timezone and new dates is the future. We're also, it's enterprise, so we're not going to kind of push anybody kicking and screaming to migrate. But we do want to make this so that there's really no reason why, if you're going to start up and spin up a new Salesforce org, we want to make it so this is just, it's a no-brainer. You're just going to default to this feature on. You'll use the new dates, and in the longer term future, we can just put all of our development effort into the new syntax and the new formats. But it's going to take us a while to get there. We really need to kind of, the first thing we actually have to do is we got to work on that feature parity. The big things right now, all of our templates, our app templates, use the old date syntax, the GMT syntax. So they're looking at kind of upgrading or having a toggle so that they can support both in parallel for a while. There's also some of those consume and engagement features, things like subscriptions, notifications, watch list. One of the limitations we have is a dashboard has to pick one. It's either all GMT or it's all Timezone. But we've implemented some of those things like the notification tracking, the watch list. We've implemented some of those as dashboards. So it's kind of interesting because now, well, what if I have a notification or a watch list and one is Timezone, one isn't, and now I'm showing two metrics side by side in two different time zones. It's one, it's kind of weird for users, and two, it's also kind of a technical challenge. So we're working through some of those just so we get that parity in those features. But yeah, eventually we want this to be kind of the new normal, the new default.
For my next question, column map. My grudge against column map is not what the feature does, it's that it doesn't accept bindings. And I think this time it may actually be a little bit more of a pain than it usually is, because as you described how they're being projected as independent columns, the date parts, and then the concatenation with the triple tilde syntax happens when we get down to column map. If I want to be able to dynamically change dates, or to change a date grouping through a toggle selector, I'm probably going to need to resort to pages as opposed to binding in static steps if I can't bind in the column map. Is that fair?
That is fair. Yeah. And that was kind of one of the things that we considered of, look, if you're getting to the place where you really need to change a lot of your column map, then pages are the solution. And now we've got component pages so that you don't need a complete other dashboard page to implement that same. It's not to say that we'll never support a column map. We actually have a user story for it sitting there, and we are kind of debating on when's the best time to pull the trigger and just allow bindings. But it is this case of like, it's really only run into these advanced use cases when you can't use pages. Or pages just, it becomes onerous. So that's where it's never been like a critical need, but we do hear it here and there. So, it's just something we're just trying to time and find like, all right, where can we kind of slip this into a release?
I think the components really addresses that use case, or addresses or mitigates some of that to a great degree. For example, if all I wanted to do was change my chart from being grouped by industry to being grouped by region, then it's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't I use a page? Well, the reason I wouldn't use a page is because I also have to maintain two sets of global filters, two sets of, like, every other component is now being mirrored across both of these pages, and they all have to be changed in concert. And it's less of like, hey, I changed the filter on this chart that's everywhere. It's more, I decided to move something ever so slightly to the right. But because now we have components, which we can interact with the pages for, you can basically pageify just that chart. So I can get why, there's a lot of my column map, frustrations go way through just new features where it's like, well, okay, now why do you need to do it? And it's very similar to the conversations that we've had over the years with everybody, where it's like, what's the number one use case that you're resorting to SACL? And the blended query UI exists to solve that kind of use case. What's my number one reason for SACL today? Post projection filter. That's my number one use case. And I no surprise that you're like, yeah, that makes sense, because little by little, you're eliminating those needs. So then, also, I noticed that, so we have the time zone enabled dashboard and we have non-time zone enabled dashboards. Does this allow you to have a degree of runway in your rollout where you could kind of say, okay, little by little, we're not going to have to do, it's not like TCRM has to come offline for 6 months while we solve for every dashboard we've ever built.
Absolutely. Yeah. Backwards compatibility was a key thing of when you turn this on, we didn't want anything to break. So everything you have works and it still runs. And even the data sets can support both syntaxes, queries in both syntaxes. So yeah, that was really critical. So then you can just start building out your content. You can pick like one dashboard at a time. Hey, I'm going to migrate the dashboards that are most critical to see in the right time zone and start migrating those. It's like one of those things that I try to plan or idealize as a PM. We want you to get to that steady state where 100% of your content is in the new syntax, using the new thing. But we also got to assume that, for some people, because they've got hundreds and hundreds of dashboards, that might be years. So we want to make sure that they have a happy state while they're in that transitional period.
Yeah. Or you might not even have it at all. There are dashboards that don't reference date fields. They exist. And who cares if it's time zone enabled? So I've only got like one question left that I think we haven't covered. What kind of impact, because of all the extra indexing that has to happen, what kind of impact can you expect to data flow performance? I would expect you to see it more there as opposed to, I wouldn't imagine we're going to see dashboard level lag, but will data flows take a hit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the answer is, a little. Because one of the things that, I talk to people and they're using like the time zone, workaround, and, they're like, well, but that's going to have an impact on my data flow. Like, well, this is going to have an impact. Like just turning it on. We don't have any magic. It's, creating indexes is work, and we don't have a magic wand to just make work disappear. Our engineers do a great job though of optimizing as much as they can. So we can take advantage of that optimization. It's definitely going to depend on the complexity. We've seen some like really long running things where it adds, 15 minutes to an hour for like, heavy, longer running. But you will see a small bump in time because there's more work to create. We're basically doubling for every date index. We're doubling. And actually, that reminds me, there's another great thing that we added here. Not only do we have a true date type, we did the appropriate thing of actually making two date types. There's now a date type and a timestamp type.
Yeah, I even commented on, I mentioned that in my video, but then
yes,
during this conversation, I realized, well, wait a minute, actually, we never had 3 data types to begin with. I just always forget because the UI let us think that, but really we just have numbers and strings. And that's kind of that's part of why we're in this pickle in the first place.
Yeah, dates were just some metadata loosely wrapped around numbers and strings. So hours, minutes, seconds, quarter, week. And then fiscal if you've got it. And then you've got the epochs. You've got day epoch and seconds epoch, millisecond epoch. We just wrapped some metadata and said, hey, all these things are actually part of the same date and there's a naming convention. But this gives you kind of a true date type. And now, what we would say is like, hey, if the hour, minutes, and seconds component isn't there, well, then it's probably a date and not a date time. But we would still kind of treat it as a date GMT, like with putting the epoch in midnight GMT. So with this gave us a choice of saying, hey, is this a date? Does this truly need to be a timestamp with hours, minutes, and seconds? Or can we just call this a date and drop all that? And that way we can do things like for close date with an opportunity, right? We can do the right thing of a close date is a close date is a close date. It doesn't really have a time zone versus a timestamp, which really the time zone does actually matter. So it lets us save some work and really only use the time zone for the things that matter. Oh, actually, let's talk. This one is beta, but we're hoping right now. So now it's kind of an opt-in. You can go as an admin, you can turn this on. We highly recommend try it in like a sandbox org first, play with it, play with the nuance, make sure it meets your requirements. And then you can enable it, enable it in your production when you're ready. We are hoping to make this GA in the next release or two, safe harbor. And so, getting early feedback though helps us tremendously. So, let me know that feedback. If you use it, you see, you love it, you see problems. We'd love to get that info.
All right. Well, looks like that's all we have for tonight. Ed, thank you very much for coming out. We should have done this a long time ago, and we should totally do it again. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and then to everybody at home, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, tell a friend, and as always, thanks for watching.